Hello everyone. Welcome to this Author Meets Critic session on my book, The Environmental Impact of Overpopulation, The Ethics of Procreation. I'm Trevor Hedberg, a postdoctoral scholar at The Ohio State University. I'm joined today by Rivka Weinberg and Christine Overall. Rivka is a professor of philosophy at Scripps College, and Christine is a professor emerita at Queen's University. I'm really excited to have both of them here. I've benefited significantly from reading their work in the past. Both of them are authors of their own books on the ethics of procreation. I'm really excited to see what criticisms they have to raise and then think about how I might respond to some of those criticisms. I'm going to kick things off with about 10 minutes of introductory remarks. Obviously, it's impossible to summarize a 200-page book in 10 minutes, but I'm going to go over a few of the main highlights and the general conclusions that I defend. After that, I'll kick it over to Rivka and Christine. Each of them will provide 15 minutes or so of comments, and then I'll take back the reins for the last 10 minutes and try to respond briefly to their comments and maybe make a couple other closing remarks. So I'm going to start by going through a very abbreviated PowerPoint that I've presented elsewhere summarizing some of the main points that I make in the book. Okay, here we go. 10-minute overview of my book, The Environmental Impact of Overpopulation, The Ethics of Procreation. Let's get into it. So I want to start with just a simple equation. I want you to think about total environmental impact of some given population as the impact per capita multiplied by the population. So the average impact per person multiplied by the population size gives you total environmental impact. Understood this way, if you look at the literature in the last few decades, the overwhelming focus has been on the impact per capita variable. If you look at an issue like climate change, or say biodiversity loss, or human treatment of animals more generally, the central focus is usually on bad behaviors, right? Consumption-heavy behaviors that deal massive damage to the environment. The focus is how do we get people to gravitate away from those particular actions. Not a lot of attention has been paid to population size. So my sort of thought was, well, maybe we can make some progress by looking more at that population variable, right? So if you think about this equation, one way, obviously, to reduce total environmental impact is indeed to reduce the average impact per person. But you could also reduce the impact by lowering the amount of people who are engaging in those harmful activities. So that was the idea. Now, this is a graph from the UN that kind of is modeling what population growth around the world looks like. The basic idea is that the growth rate, as you can see by the yellow line, it's been going steadily down over the last several decades, which, if the goal is population stabilization, is good, but total population has still been going up. It's been tapering off, but that tapering off has been very gradual. And the UN estimates that by 2100, we're going to be sitting at right around 11 billion people. Their most recent estimates put it at 10.9 in their medium variance scenario, which is represented by this dotted line right here. So that's a lot of people. That's about 3 billion people more than we currently have, and there's some evidence that the current numbers we have are already kind of teetering on being unsustainable. So why is population growth bad? Well, first thing I want to say is it's not bad in itself. It's bad because it makes certain problems that are created by aggregated human behaviors harder to solve. Whoops, let's keep that on there. So here are a few of them. Food shortages, freshwater shortages, species extinctions, just some people might cast this out in terms of biodiversity loss, just loss of species as a result of human beings taking up more and more habitat, and in other ways putting increased stress on non-human beings in various ecosystems. And the big one, probably the one that looms largest in the book, is climate change. So all of these problems are significant in various ways around the world, but they are all made worse by the fact that we just have larger numbers of people. More people means more mouths to feed, more water to provide, more stress on finding ways to share the environment with non-human animals. And more people means more CO2 emissions and other fossil fuel emissions. And so greater contributions to climate change, other things held equal. So again, population growth not bad in itself, but it makes lots of other problems harder to solve. So everybody agrees that reducing impact per capita is a big part of the solution to our problem. We need transition, for example, away from unsustainable fuel sources and toward renewable energy. We need to transition toward more sustainable agricultural practices that perhaps involve producing a smaller number of non-human animals for food and eating more vegetarian products. We need to find better ways to distribute food and water to large groups of people. The list goes on. Everybody agrees, including everybody writing about this issue with an emphasis on population, everybody agrees reducing impact per capita is important. My proposal, though, is that there's still meaningful progress to be made when it comes to population. Progress on the impact per capita variable has been so slow and so fraught with difficulty. There's also a reasonable objection to be made to that approach that long-term sustainability may require a global population that is significantly smaller than what we have now, even if we engage in kind of the behavioral changes that we currently have. So here's the basic proposal. How about, in addition to working to reduce our rates of environmentally harmful consumption, we also work to stabilize and eventually reduce global population to work on addressing some of these problems. Now, what prevents this from happening? What are some of the obstacles to this dialogue? I'm going to go through these very quickly because they're pretty well known. First, population policies in the past have been associated with some major human rights abuses and eugenics-based agendas. These were morally repugnant, and looking back, they've been pretty much universally condemned by everybody who's written about this subject. These are complete non-starters, but the very idea of discussing population raises this specter in the background, and it makes some people uneasy. So that's one reason the dialogue has trouble getting off the ground. Additionally, you've got Thomas Malthus and Paul Ehrlich, who are sort of both notorious for making incredibly inaccurate claims about the relationship between population growth and food production. Changes in agricultural technology prevented the mass starvation that both of them predicted. And so there's a temptation here to then say, well, because these people historically made wrong predictions about population, it doesn't really matter anymore. I'd encourage you not to make that jump, but it is a jump that some people make. And also some economists associate population growth with economic growth, and if you think economic growth is really, really valuable and important, and that's the be-all end-all, then you want a growing and burgeoning population because that means a larger workforce, more people pumping income into your society, and so on. So the good news is there's a pretty wide range of different options that we can use to try to make progress on this issue. And I'm kind of looking at them on a spectrum from coercive options to not coercive options. Coercive options restrict autonomy, not coercive options enhance autonomy. On the coercive side, the most extreme coercive case that's well known would probably be China's one-child policy. This was a very clear restriction on autonomy, and it also in practice had a lot of problems with its implementation, forced abortions and sterilizations, various kinds of undesirable effects on gender inequality. Wasn't a good time, not something I'm going in for in my own approach. Good news is we've got a lot of options on the other end of the spectrum. You've got increasing access to contraception, you've got improving sex education, you've got improving environmental education. These things increase autonomy without having any real notable moral problems associated with them. To me, they're the closest thing we have in this domain to no-brainers. They would provide significant benefits, they would provide benefits, to be clear, that are independent of whether or not they result in reducing population. So they would just allow people to exercise their reproductive freedom more effectively, and that seems valuable into any of this discussion of population. More in the what we might call the neutral zone, or like what I label in the book semi-coercive measures, you've got media campaigns to counter antinatalist stigma, and you've got incentivization strategies. So incentivization strategies would refer to providing some kind of perhaps economic incentives for people to have smaller families, maybe inverting the tax structure so that tax breaks to people who have a fewer amount of children rather than giving it to families who have larger amounts of children. The main purpose of the media campaigns would be to kind of promote the idea that smaller families are socially acceptable, perhaps kind of counteracting some of the pronatalist stigma that exists in many societies, and also just improving people's awareness of the impact that their procreative decisions have on the environment and on people around them. Now, the book isn't just about policies, it's also to some extent about individual procreative decision making. So, just to give you an idea of what some of my conclusions are there, imagine that you and your partner are deliberating about how many children to have in light of the facts about population growth and the connection to environmental impact. Here are a few of the conclusions that I defend. First, I reject antinatalism, which is the view that it's generally bad to procreate and that everyone ought to have 0 children. I do advocate a sort of some level of restriction. So I reject the notion that you could justify having 3 or more children because that's well above replacement fertility. So I am in favor of, like, I think morality does demand a certain degree of restriction on procreative behavior, but it's not antinatalism, and it's also totally contingent about our current circumstances. If our population situation were different and environmental sustainability was more achievable with a large population or with a population of our current size, standards might be different. But anyway, the ultimate view that I go in for is something along these lines. It may be possible to justify having 2 biological children, though I'm somewhat uncertain as how many people could justify that, could actually meet the justificatory demand for having more than 1 child. Sarah Conley's probably done the most rigorous job in her work in trying to defend the idea that almost all of the good reasons for procreating can be satisfied by just having 1 child. I'm not fully sold on that story. I think there may be some people who could justify having a second one, but I do think that that's a very tough burden to meet given the connection between procreation and these various environmental impacts that threaten the welfare of present and future people. So that's a very quick and dirty gloss of some of the main ideas in the book, but I've exhausted my introductory time, so I'm going to turn things over to Rivka and Christine for their comments. Rivka will be up first.
Hello, and thank you for having me. My name is Rivka Weinberg. I'm a professor of philosophy at Scripps College in Claremont. I'm honored to speak today about Professor Trevor Hedberg's important and provocative book, The Environmental Impact of Overpopulation, The Ethics of Procreation. In this thorough work, Professor Hedberg invites a hard look at some of the most intractable dilemmas of our day, namely how to manage our environmental impact without draconian steps at population control, which have often in the past proven oppressive and discriminatory. We are straining the resources of our planet. We've overheated it to catastrophic effects, and we are too many. What to do? We might hope to alleviate this via technological advances, just as we managed to technologically advance our food production to avoid Malthusian predictions of mass starvation due to a population beyond the capacity of the Earth's food supply. But it's hard to imagine that we can tech our way out of global warming. In fact, some might say that we have already failed to do so. Renewable non-heating sources of energy are being used, but as Professor Hedberg shows, it is hard to imagine that these sorts of technological changes can alone make up for how much each person's carbon footprint adds to our environmental woes, and even more so to the environmental woes of future people. Future people are, as Professor Hedberg convincingly argues, of no less moral importance than us. We were once future people too. For their sake, we must reduce our numbers to a more manageable effects. Okay, let us accept that. We then confront 2 crucial questions. 1, how, and 2, will that suffice? These 2 questions are not unrelated because the first, how, turned out to be thorny and fraught with a lot of problems. And that puts a lot of pressure on the second, will that suffice? Because if it won't, then we have more reason for caution about how we go about trying to reduce the population anyway. If it's not going to help that much, then we have more reason to be cautious about steps that we take to urge people to reduce their procreativity. So let's discuss some of the hows. Professor Hedberg begins with what he calls autonomy enhancing measures or changes to population control and reduction. These include education, access to contraception, and women's autonomy. All quite excellent ways of reducing population without oppressing anyone or venturing into any shadily coercive territory. According to Professor Hedberg, 40% of our pregnancies worldwide are unplanned. We'll just get rid of those and we're pretty much at our goals. No, Professor Hedberg is skeptical that autonomy enhancing measures will accomplish this and reach us to our goals, citing areas of the world where access to contraception and or education seem pretty adequate, yet birth rates remain high. I am less skeptical than he is about autonomy enhancing measures for population reduction because I don't think that any morally acceptable and politically viable means of reducing population can even hope for more than a 40% reduction in the global birth rate. If we can achieve a 40% reduction by eliminating unplanned pregnancy via autonomy-enhancing means, to me, that is very clearly where to put our efforts. Professor Hedberg, however, thinks we have to consider what he terms semi-coercive measures. I worry that trying to be just a little coercive will be just as futile as trying to be a little bit pregnant. But let's take a look at some of the semi-coercive measures that Professor Hedberg considers. He argues in favor of ad campaigns to adjust people's preferences. That doesn't sound too coercive, right? But it also doesn't sound that effective either. Ad campaigns against smoking or just say no to drugs were not successful. One wonders whether these sorts of campaigns may even have the opposite effect by making people think about babies and families or inspiring feelings of opposition and rebellion. But I agree that if an ad campaign would be effective, it is morally acceptable. However, I would put that in the category of education and thus in the category of autonomy enhancing measures. Professor Hedberg then considers incentivizing people not to have children by giving money to the poor to have fewer children and imposing a penalty from the rich should they have too many children. The problem is that in order to be effective, you're going to have to penalize the rich quite a lot because people are willing to pay a lot of money to have children. There already is a financial penalty, or put more in everyday terms, a high cost to having children. Children cost a lot of money to care for and raise. Adding a further tax or a penalty to the rich if they have more children than we want them to have is unlikely to deter anyone unless the tax or the penalty is high enough to be very coercive, not semi-coercive. It's also politically and culturally untenable in most free societies. Since we won't be able to penalize the rich enough to deter procreation without being unacceptably oppressive, it won't be fair to only target the poor with cash incentives. It's also a little creepily eugenic to pay poor people not to have children, and unnecessary. Having children is already very expensive, so poor people are already incentivized not to have them. For these reasons, I think that financial incentives are a problematic and ineffective way to reduce population, to reduce the population. And that also applies to, if not more so, to the idea of reducing population by considering procreation as, quote, sellable entitlements, end quote, which is something that Professor Hedberg considers as well. Sellable entitlements commodifies children and creates a marketplace procreative ethos that is in tension with widely held views of persons as beyond price and seems untenable to me. We move on to more intrusive possibilities, such as mandatory long-term contraception. I'm not sure why Professor Hedberg considers this to be a semi-coercive population reduction measure. Forcing people to insert things into their bodies sounds fully coercive to me. And although we sometimes do this sort of thing when we mandate immunizations for public health exigencies, there are significant differences between vaccinations for contagious diseases and contraception. First, one of the strongest reasons we have for mandating vaccines is that we mandate them for contagious diseases, for diseases that affect other people. Since pregnancy is not contagious, the rationale of direct harm to your neighbors is not present. Harm to future people from overpopulation is less direct, even though it is still morally significant. Second, the diseases we vaccinate people to prevent are diseases nobody wants. Nobody wants the measles. So nobody wants the opposite of the intended effect of the vaccine. The vaccine is to prevent you from getting the measles. Some people don't want the vaccine, but they don't want the measles. But mandatory long-term contraception will force those who don't want the intended effects of the mandatory contraception to have them. They want to be pregnant, and the mandatory contraception is intended to prevent that. Third, most, if not all, mandatory vaccines have only transient minor side effects. Long-term contraception has daily side effects that many find uncomfortable or even intolerable. The right to bodily integrity and privacy argues against mandatory long-term contraception. I'll also add that we don't usually force people to vaccinate. We just say you have to vaccinate in order to go to school or something like that. I want to take a moment here to talk about rights. Professor Hedberg notes that coercive population reduction measures are problematically coercive and not particularly effective. He rejects them as counterproductive, but he argues that we should not say that they are never warranted. He argues that, quote, killing an innocent person is one of the worst crimes one can commit, but if killing one innocent person is required to save the lives of 10 other innocent people, then such a killing may well be morally permissible, end quote. But this is not how rights-based or principle-based moral theories work. Principle-based deontological moral theories differ from outcomes-based consequentialist theories in that they don't look to states of affairs or maximization of the good to justify actions. Principle-based theories are based on the bedrock value of persons as ends in themselves and deserving of respect. This means this special status that persons have constrains how they can be treated. The ends don't justify the means. It's therefore incorrect to argue that killing one to save 10 may be permissible on a rights-based, principle-based deontological theory. That is precisely what deontology prohibits. If persons are ends in themselves, they are not exchangeable for other goods and cannot be sacrificed for the sake of others. That is what Kant's famous principle of respect for persons demands. For these same reasons, talk of, quote, consequentialism of rights, end quote, which Professor Hedberg considers as a possible justification for coercive population control measures, is similarly incompatible with rights-based, principle-based deontological moral theories. Some deontologists, such as Christine Korsgaard, have argued that when you are faced with a situation where you must violate a right, you should uphold the right that is more in spirit of the principle. But that's not the same thing as killing a person, which violates a right, in order to save others, which you are not required, indeed not permitted, to violate rights in order to do. I will not argue here for principle-based moral theories over outcome-based moral theories, except to note two things. First, principle-based moral theories do not allow for consequentialism of rights or for killing one to save 10 others. Second, because population ethics involves the future, one potential disadvantage for an outcomes-based moral theory is that it involves making decisions with incomplete information, since the future is always unknown to some degree. Principle-based moral theories, on the other hand, may be right or wrong, but they don't need to attempt to predict the future to decide what is the moral thing to do now. Professor Hedberg, keenly aware of the problems associated with both semi-coercive and fully coercive measures to reduce population, settles on recommending that families limit their procreativity to one child only. This is not this is not an unreasonable recommendation. It is well below replacement. Replacement is 2.1 children per couple, though in fairness, that's the point. The point is to fall below replacement, to not replace all of us, and to reduce population. But requiring people to only have one child eliminates the sibling relationship. Maybe we should do this, but it deserves more consideration than I think it is given in this work. Professor Hedberg argues that the value of the sibling relationship is unproven and that having children has been shown to decrease happiness. I would caution us regarding what the researchers count as happiness, given that it is common for people to speak of having children as the most meaningful and fulfilling part of their lives. Not necessarily happiness, but arguably better than happiness. And as for the value of the sibling relationship, I think it's important to note that for many people, the sibling relationship is the longest and most reliable relationship of their lives, usually outlasting the parent-child relationship because siblings are closer in age. A sibling is often the person on whom an adult can most rely on for material and emotional support. Professor Hedberg closes with an argument that he says is based on integrity. But integrity just tells you to live by your principles, so it's not going to require you to adopt any principles or values that you don't already hold. It doesn't do any argumentative work on its own here. So when Professor Hedberg argues that, premise 1, individuals should live with integrity. Premise 2, individuals should cooperate in working toward a collective political solution to overpopulation. Premise 3, if individuals should live with integrity and cooperate in working toward a collective political solution to overpopulation, then they should limit their individual procreation. Conclusion, therefore, individuals should limit their individual procreation. All the work in this argument is being done by premise 2, right? Premise 2 is the one that says individuals should cooperate in working toward a collective political solution to overpopulation. That's also the conclusion. So I'm not sure how this argument works. And sure, if you think that we should cooperate in the collective solution to overpopulation, and you also think that the way to do that is by limiting individual procreation, you would agree with the conclusion. But integrity doesn't seem to be playing any role in this argument. One of the reasons Professor Hedberg tries to base his argument for limiting procreativity on integrity is because he retains a discomfort with the coercive nature of semi-coercive and fully coercive population reduction measures, and he is skeptical of the effectiveness of autonomy-enhancing measures. I am less skeptical of autonomy-enhancing measures, especially given that Professor Hedberg cites research pointing to a potential 40% reduction in pregnancies on the basis of the availability of contraception and education alone. And I am more skeptical about whether population reduction is the best solution to our environmental problems. Since most of our worst pollution occurs in the production phase of our consumption, that may be where we should put most of our policy focus. If gasoline-powered cars were not produced, that would put a whole lot less burnt fuel into our overheated atmosphere. If public transportation was cheap and reliable all over the world, that would help a lot too. If we ran our economies on renewable energy rather than on burning fossil fuels, we would go a long way to halting the overheating that is the main cause of our current crisis. If factory farming were banned, that could also go a long way toward reducing carbon emissions and probably methane too. If zoning laws didn't permit people to live in an oversized home, that would cut down on heating and cooling. If lawns were banned in areas where rain doesn't do the watering for you, we would waste a lot less water. I'm sure there are countless changes of this sort, which would occur at the level of industry, agriculture, and energy sourcing. These sorts of changes, it seems to me, are less personally oppressive to implement and quite possibly far more efficacious in terms of reducing environmental degradation. Driving an electric rather than gas-burning car will not pose a deep challenge to the meaning of anyone's life and does not require governmental interference into the deepest recesses of our private lives. The same goes for most of the changes I mentioned. When we couple these sorts of changes with autonomy-enhancing population reduction measures, I believe we will have made progress toward limiting and perhaps even reversing our environmental crisis. Professor Hedberg's wide-ranging and very important work will help us consider these possibilities. Thank you very much.
Hello, my name is Christine Overall, and this is my commentary on Trevor Hedberg's new book. I'm just going to share my screen. Though its title is somewhat misleading, The Environmental Impact of Overpopulation is about the ethics of population control. It is a wonderful book. Beautifully organized and clearly written, it contains some ingenious new arguments that definitely enhance the debate about procreative ethics and population ethics. In particular, I value Hedberg's discussion of the various arguments for antinatalism and his thorough response to them. I also appreciate the appendix in which he provides an in-depth critical assessment of the non-identity problem. In commenting, I should first acknowledge that I agree with virtually all of Hedberg's main claims. I accept the population reduction argument, which shows that, quote, we should be pursuing near-term population stabilization and long-term population reduction. And I agree that, quote, those who have control over their reproductive choices should limit their biological offspring to 1 child per person, 2 children per couple. Indeed, as Hedberg acknowledges, I argued for this very same claim in my own book on the ethics of choosing to have children. So my focus in this commentary is confined to a couple of areas where I think Hedberg's views are simply inconsistent with his overriding goal of advocating population reduction and the best way to achieve it. To be specific, I'm going to talk about fetuses and old people. I suggest that the reduction of population size would and should be achieved via controlling and limiting the birth of new human beings. But there are 2 areas where Hedberg seems not to endorse that standpoint. One is in his position on abortion, and the other is in his position on medical care for old people. Hedberg's views on abortion are definitely ambivalent. He writes, quote, I do believe that women should have the ability to obtain abortions during the first trimester of pregnancy, and in some circumstances later in the pregnancy. But my reasons for holding this, I'll just move my picture, this view are not tied to the problem of population growth. In other words, he surprisingly does not value a policy of open access to abortion as one means, an important one, of controlling births. Hedberg points out that the fetus becomes sentient around 30 weeks. In practice, he says, recognizing the significance of sentience might result in a policy of permitting the abortion of fetuses during the first trimester when the fetus is clearly not sentient, and only allowing abortions in exceptional circumstances after the first trimester. Hedberg then reiterates that, quote, increasing access to family planning services should also entail giving women greater access to abortion services during at least the first trimester. But this position does not result from thinking that the imperative to reduce population automatically warrants allowing more women to receive abortions. This position is problematic for a number of reasons. I suggest, for example, that abortion is not something that is merely allowed to women, but is part of the services that are necessary for maintaining women's reproductive health. I have also come to believe that the status of the fetus depends on its relationship with the pregnant woman, in whose body it is wholly located and on whose body it is wholly dependent. But most relevant to this discussion, liberal access to abortion services should surely be an integral aspect of the social policies that promote smaller families. Hedberg himself tells us that many people desire fewer children than they actually have. And he also comments on the fact that, quote, globally, 40% of pregnancies are unplanned, and a significant portion of pregnancies remain unplanned, even in parts of the world where contraception is readily available. This fact implies that there are many, many unwanted pregnancies. However, not all of them can be aborted within the first trimester. Some women fail to be aware early on that they are pregnant. Some women have various difficulties accessing abortion services immediately, and some women may take a while to come to a decision to end their pregnancy. Hence, for those of us committed to promoting population stabilization and reduction, it makes every sense to support a much more liberal abortion policy than he recommends, and to see abortion services not as independent of population reduction, but as a necessary part of the drive to reduce population size via the free choice of women who need or want to end their pregnancies. At the other end of human life, Hedberg also seems to have ambivalent views about the lives of old people. Hedberg accepts the widespread but unfounded view that growing numbers of old people are an actual or potential burden to the rest of the population. On page 75, he writes, one short-term concern about decreasing population is that there will be too few young members of the population relative to the number of elderly people. One consequence of having a smaller working population is that the tax base declines, decreasing government revenue. Another is that there is an increased demand for medical care, which requires the government to spend more on health coverage. This combination of effects creates a significant dilemma. Either the young working members of society must bear a greater burden to support the elderly, or medical care to the elderly must be more strictly rationed. Later, on page 147, he adds further worries about this growing proportion of old people. He says that this growing proportion will result, quote, in economic stagnation because there are fewer working class members of society, and can lead to lower standards of living if the government has to make cuts to manage the nation's budget. But even worse, he writes, is the fact that, quote, This economic stagnation could make it harder for a nation to fund the mitigation and adaptation measures needed to fight climate change or diminish its ability to contribute to international anti-poverty efforts. In short, having relatively high numbers of old people will cause government revenue to decline, require an increase in the amount of health care, create a burden on young people, produce economic stagnation, and compromise the capacity to deal with serious international problems such as climate change. Phew. Apparently, I belong to a demographic that is truly a problem. Will some old people incur extra costs? Of course. People have different needs at different stages of their lives. It would be surprising if old people did not have different medical issues than 30-year-olds. But are old people collectively a burden as our numbers grow? I don't have time here to develop at length all the ways in which I believe it is a mistake to think of old people as primarily a liability, though I have written about this at length in other work. I'll just mention a few facts about old people, facts that are easily verifiable through a little research. Old people are not all the same. We range in age from 65 to 105 or more. Many old people still do paid work. Many old people pay taxes on the products and services they buy, on earned income, on pensions, or on investments. Many old people do indispensable volunteer work, caring for children, grandchildren, spouses, and other individuals, and working in a variety of charitable groups and community institutions. Many old people donate money to a variety of nonprofit and charitable organizations. Many old people are healthy and active. Indeed, in the developed world, we are considerably healthier than our previous generations of old people. That's why we live longer. Relatively few old people are actually in long-term care. Most of us live independently. Most poignantly, many old people are parents and grandparents and aunts and uncles and colleagues and teachers and friends of young people who will miss them sadly when they die. And those young people will themselves become old someday, if they're lucky. But the main point I want to make here is not only about false presuppositions about the alleged inevitable burdensomeness of old people. It is about what Hedberg takes to be the implications of the goal of reducing population for the very lives of old people. Recall that he said that, quote, the young working members of society must bear a greater burden to support the elderly, or medical care to the elderly must be more strictly rationed. He also mentions the view of people like Daniel Callahan that, quote, we ought to ration life-extending healthcare on the grounds that medical resources are limited and that keeping the very old alive for a bit longer through expensive procedures is an inappropriate use of limited resources. In any case, Hedberg then writes, the need to reduce population would seem to make the case for such rationing even stronger. But of course, doing so means that some older members of society will not receive treatments that could extend their lives. I anticipated that Hedberg would then argue against the prejudicial claim that medical care for old people might have to be rationed. After all, unlike fetuses, old people are indisputably persons and are owed the same respect and support owed to all persons. To suggest that some unspecified older members of society could be denied life-saving medical treatments is nothing more than ageism. Age-based rationing unjustifiably discriminates against an entire category of persons without regard for their healthcare needs or the capacity to ameliorate or cure their medical condition. Unfortunately, I looked in vain for any such refutation from Hedberg, which is disappointing because this idea of age-based rationing, if acted upon, or even just widely promulgated, will lead to even less respect for old people's needs and abilities than we have now. And how low that respect already is becomes obvious when we contemplate how old people have been cared for or not cared for during the pandemic. To be fair, elsewhere Hedberg does write, we should not strive to lower population by causing existing people to die. But he makes that statement in connection with his advocacy of limiting abortion access to the first trimester. Elsewhere, he also mentions increasing life expectancies all around the world and argues that, quote, since the increases in life expectancy are a result of better medical care and a significant reduction in human misery, we should not deliberately aim to lower life expectancy. A far better way to reduce population is to bring fewer people into existence, end of quote. I agree, but this comment is not, to my mind, enough to answer his grave and threatening gesture toward healthcare rationing for old people. Indeed, on page 78, he writes that we should accept that some rights violations, perhaps in the form of inequality or unintentional coercion, will be experienced by present people as a result of efforts to reduce population, despite our best efforts to avoid these outcomes. To me, allowing people's lives to end when their deaths could be prevented just because they're old is simply not acceptable. But Hedberg has taken a position in which he is inclined to deny a woman access to abortion to end the existence of an unwanted fetus in the 4th or 5th month of its gestation. But he would consider sacrificing the life of an 80-year-old who might otherwise be saved by denying her medical care. Trevor Hedberg's views on abortion access and medical care for old people are simply inconsistent with the main goal of his otherwise laudable book. For me, limiting abortion access and rationing medical care for old people are bad social policies if our goal is to bring about population reduction, which, as Hedberg himself says, means bringing fewer people into existence. Limiting abortion access thwarts an important tool for controlling births. Rationing medical care for old people violates the rights of one group of people on the basis of an invidious criterion, age. And it has nothing to do with controlling births. Population reduction should be about controlling and reducing births, not about causing or allowing premature deaths of persons. Thank you very much for your attention.
I want to thank Christine and Rivka for their comments on the work. I can't do full justice to their comments here because of the time constraints, but I'll offer a couple quick responses. First, on the application of rights-based theories, my main concern about them is that if they're left in isolation, they generate too many no-solution results. So there are lots of situations where we can't properly respect the rights of every single person affected by a decision or a policy, but often those are there's still situations where we have to make a decision. And I think that in those cases, falling back on a minimization of harm or a minimization of injustice type principle is appropriate. I also want to clarify one thing on semi-coercive measures. I think that my approach is actually fairly cautious. I am perhaps more open to them than some other authors, but I acknowledge at the end of the chapter that I'm in favor of a case-by-case analysis where the threshold for their implementation is actually set very high because the history surrounding incentivization schemes, for example, is not good. Usually they wind up turning into outright coercion when they're implemented poorly. And this is similar to my thoughts on the long-term mandatory contraception. Like, that's a proposal I think is interesting and worth considering, but actually not one that I ultimately endorse, in part because it's not currently technologically feasible. Now I want to move on to the integrity argument. Here's the integrity argument as it appears in the book. Feel free to pause and look at the fine print. Here's what the argument is meant to accomplish. It is possible to object to my position by saying that yes, I endorse this collective political obligation, but a person could theoretically at least deny that individuals have specific, powerful moral reasons to limit their own procreation. So in other words, you could have a situation where someone says, yes, I endorse this goal, but I still think that I as an individual should be allowed to have 4 kids because, I mean, it's only 4 kids, it's only a couple extra kids, it doesn't make that much of a difference. The same kind of argument can be made, like with respect to climate change, right? Endorse the political obligation to do something about climate change, but then say, well, my individual emissions don't really make a difference, so who cares if I joyride on Sundays or whatever. So this is my attempt to rule out that kind of position and to say, no, actually, if you want to be a person of integrity, you should strive to have your political aspirations and your personal behaviors integrated in the proper way. And that's what the argument's meant to accomplish. So let me turn now to Christine's criticisms. She makes two charges of inconsistency, one of which is about my stance on abortion, one of which is about my stance on rationing healthcare to the elderly. It should maybe come as no surprise I'm going to plead not guilty to both those charges. My view on abortion, I think, differs from hers in that she mentions that she endorses a relational view about the moral status of the fetus. I endorse a capacity-oriented view. This is the same view I hold with respect to the moral status of adult human beings and non-human animals. According to this view, the moral status of an entity is dependent entirely on the capacities that it possesses. The capacities relevant to personhood, capacities related to, say, cognitive ability, use of language, ability to feel pleasure and pain, and so on. The historical roots of my view on abortion, I believe, were first defended by L.W. Sumner in a book called Abortion and Moral Theory. The basic idea is that as the fetus progresses through the pregnancy and takes on more and more of the features of personhood, its moral status progressively gets bigger and bigger. Sumner thought that the most plausible dividing line between a fetus that did not have any robust moral standing and a fetus that did was when the fetus became sentient. I've also been influenced in part by a number of writings by Jeff McMahon. I'm projecting one of his papers up here on the topic. McMahon has argued in several writings that it is very, very hard to have a permissible view of late-term abortion and an impermissible view of infanticide. He's argued many times that it's not possible to differentiate between a really, really late-term fetus and a newborn infant, because some really, really late-term fetuses could be newborn infants if they were just born prematurely, like a few weeks earlier. I'm not going to go through all the arguments. I'll just say that I've been fairly convinced by that line, and since I'm somewhat committed to the view that infanticide is wrong, I'm inclined to say, well, it must be the case that there are some late-term fetuses that it is therefore also wrong to abort, just like it would be wrong to kill a newborn infant. So that's why I hold the position I do on abortion. Okay, so now the obvious follow-up question: how does this idea of being reluctant to potentially kill a late-term fetus to, reduce population growth, how does that square with the idea of potentially rationing healthcare to the elderly? Now, Christine points out that I float that idea tentatively, and I neither really endorse it nor really condemn it in the text. So what's my actual view? Well, the reason that I don't take a clear stance on it is because I think that we're going to be pushed to consider some morally tragic choices. I am not in favor of rationing healthcare to the elderly. I'm also not in favor of failing to meet duties to mitigate and adapt to climate change on behalf of future people. So, but the problem is we may wind up in situations where we can't do both, and we have to make choices about what we prioritize. And so once again, we're in kind of this morally tragic situation where somebody's going to experience injustice one way or another. I don't take a stance on rationing healthcare to the elderly in comparison to those choices because I don't know what the right answer is. And I don't know if that can be determined in the abstract. Well, we've just about run out of time for this session. Before we go, I wanted to share with you the book site on Routledge in case you wanted to recommend it to your university library. The hardback's pretty pricey, but the ebook's a lot more reasonable. If you're interested in doing that, maybe you can give it a look, follow in the footsteps of Rivka and Christine, tell me what I got wrong. You can contact me at hedberg.12@osu.edu or trevor.hedberg@gmail.com. You can also check out some of my other work at trevorhedberg.com. Once again, I want to thank Rivka and Christine for engaging with my work and participating in this panel, and on their behalf, I want to thank all of you in the audience for listening to our discussion. We hope you enjoyed it, and that you have a great rest of your day.